Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Binge Live. I'm Jason Pramas, Executive Director of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism in fabulous Boston. And tonight I have with me, as usual, Chris Faraone, our Editorial Director, and our special guest, Andrew Quemere, longtime Binge investigative reporter. And we're just going to jump right into it. Chris, being, the editor of all our big pieces, has been Andrew's editor forever. So he's going to just get us all started. So go for it, Chris.
I will say, thanks for that, and Andrew, thanks for being here. I will say, Andrew, technically I'm an editor. Andrew's a crack writer, though, and anyone who reads his stuff over at the Mass Dump or any of the other outlets he's been involved with, occasionally writes for our good friend Luke O'Neill at Welcome to Hell World, knows that without us, he does just fine. But we are proud to have done some significant work this year. But I want to bring it back a little. So, first of all, where'd you get the T-shirt that you're wearing? Because that's an oldie but goodie, and I think that's kind of like. And I just want to hear, because I know some of the work that you've been really doing stuff for us from almost the beginning. And why don't you tell us about how you got into it? And I know you're. I don't know if you consider yourself a FOIA expert. I consider you one. But just tell us about your interest in public records and how you got into this work.
Well,
Yeah, there you go.
we founded BINJ like a decade ago, so I think I probably had this shirt for about 10 years now.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, no, I public records has been a big focus of a lot of the work I've done. And I actually have ongoing 2 public records lawsuits right now against the Northwestern and Bristol County District Attorney's Office. We're suing them, I should say I'm suing them, but with the help of Harvard Law School's Cyber Law Clinic for records
great. We
related
know them.
to
Yeah.
records related to police misconduct investigations. That's been something that's been ongoing for a few years now, but we're starting to have some movement with that. I just filed a motion for summary judgment in one of the lawsuits recently. So we're hoping to get, I believe we're going to get into court possibly this December for that case to argue it. The other one's going to take a little bit longer, but yeah, I've always been interested in public records, like how you can pry information from the government. But lately, the main thing I've been working on is wrongful convictions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I use public records with to a certain extent, but a lot more of it is just like, court records or like, human sources, getting to know lawyers and the actual, people who have been wrongfully convicted. And I'm sorry, I guess I should tell people the site I write is the Mass Dump, and if you just Google it, it should come up right before all of the garbage dumps in Massachusetts as the top search result. It's a Substack newsletter that I send out kind of sporadically, but as I was saying, I primarily have been writing about wrongful convictions for a little while now, and I did, one story that was co-published by BINJ and The Appeal about James Carver, who was a guy from Danvers who in the 1980s was convicted of setting this deadly rooming house fire that killed 15 people. But his conviction was actually overturned in December after 36 years in prison.
Well, hold on. This is a huge thing. I mean, this is like now I have to edit because this is the I want to know how you got into this stuff in the first place. I mean, honestly,
Sure.
Because when it comes to we got a minute here. When it comes to wrongful convictions, right? I think this is one of those topics where I feel like, not that I'm always looking to like bridge the divide, but it's certainly something I feel like whatever side of any aisle or whatever, it should be a crowd pleaser. I feel like sometimes when it's like Sean Ellis, some of we've had some big cases that have gotten attention. I don't know if Karen Reed goes into this category. But some of the ones you're looking at are just egregious, have gotten almost no attention. So just tell us about your interest in the topic. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as far as I see, clearly you take interest in stories that often people have given up on or never gave a shit about in the first place.
Well, I mean, I can't take too much credit because really the people who find these cases are, well, I mean, there's the lawyers who take these cases and they have to do a tremendous amount of investigation before they can, try to overturn these cases
Of
in court.
course.
And of course, there's the people themselves who obviously have to be very uh, well, resilient, but that's not entirely what I mean. They have to be, I, I guess, resilient. Yeah, they have to be, sort of willing to not give up and to keep trying to fight to get their cases overturned. Otherwise, people will just forget about it. To the extent anyone, is really paying attention in the first place. But when I am looking at these cases, they're kind of already there's already well, I guess when a person is wrongfully convicted, there's been a
Yeah.
narrative that's been told about them that they're guilty of this crime and that we have all this evidence that proves that they're guilty. And sort of by the time it gets to me, there's already a counter narrative that, well, we found new evidence or whatever. So I can't take too much credit, but at the same time, I think it's important to highlight these stories because of what they tell us about the criminal justice system, uh, so-called, and it is uh, that it's sort of a scary truth, but like a lot of people, like it's like almost like they don't care whether they're getting people who are guilty or not.
It's
Like
crazy.
I wrote about another case recently, Eddie Wright out of Springfield, Massachusetts, and this is a case where he was convicted of murdering his friend. He had left her. He dropped her. He picked her up after work, dropped her off at her apartment, spent some time there. He left. She's murdered, and then he's convicted of murdering her because he's like the last person seen alive with her. But what turned and the person who prosecuted his case, like who actually tried the case in court, was the Springfield district attorney at the time. So it wasn't just some random prosecutor; it was the actual elected DA of Hampden County, um, Matthew Ryan at the time in the 1980s, and they the prosecutor said, he's linked to this crime scene because we found this like shoe prints with blood in them on the crime scene, and they are similar to the shoes he was wearing when he was arrested shortly after the murder. And I mean, there's a lot of problems with that evidence you can go into, but the reason the judge overturned the case was because they hid the fact from his defense that someone broke into the crime scene while the investigation was ongoing, and they didn't find the shoe prints until after the break-in.
Oh,
And they had already been investigating the scene for several days before they noticed this. So chances are he didn't even, even though he was at the apartment, he didn't even leave the shoe prints, more than likely, which means there's no actual forensic evidence that he was there at the time of the murder. Like, we know he was there the morning before his friend was killed, but
Right.
the only like evidence he was actually there when she was murdered was the shoe print with the blood establishing presumably that it happened at the time of this murder. And or so the jury was told, but it wasn't. It had nothing to do with him because it probably appeared after this break-in, and then they didn't do anything to investigate the break-in. And then over the decades, his lawyers have done all this further investigation, and they found out that like another guy confessed to like his family and his girlfriend that he broke in, stole things from the crime scene, and also that he did the murder. Um,
so
and and this isn't even what led to his conviction being overturned. What led to his conviction being overturned is the fact that eventually the DA's office provided a report showing they knew about the break-in, and so it basically it added all this evidence showing that these previous claims that this other guy had broken in and probably done the murder had like actual support. And this report sort of um, the family members of this other suspect who, their testimony was corroborated by this report because they had no idea this report existed, never mind what was said in it, but what they said lined up with the report of this break-in. So, and meanwhile, all for the 40 years this guy was in prison, the DA's office had the report about the break-in. And a police officer actually lied on the stand during this guy's trial
Oh, we're
and
shocked.
said, yeah, and he said, like, the only people who were in, there at the time we were investigating were the police. So if he had just said on the stand, "Oh, actually, there was a break-in and we didn't bother finding out who did it," uh, then the whole case could have fallen apart, and this guy might have never
Nefarious, man.
spent 40 years in
Unbelievable.
prison.
And I'll so I guess, so it's like, and of course we'll talk about some pending legislation, and I don't suspect, I don't suppose there's any legislation proposed for accountability for any of these people who throw people's lives away for
Right.
decades. So before we get into James Carver, just why don't you briefly tell us the situation, which of course it's demoralizing to look at any of this through the lens of money, through that capitalist lens. But why don't you just tell us about the roof, the ceiling, the limits to compensation in Massachusetts, and what has to, and what some people, because you were, even before Carver, you were writing about some of this for us. So tell us about wrongful conviction compensation in Mass and that background behind everything we're talking about.
So it's funny, actually, when I was going into the courthouse in Springfield back in I think it was in August, after Edward Wright he'd already been released from prison, but there was possibility that he would be tried again. But then the DA's office dropped the case. Of course, they're still claiming that he's guilty. We just can't prove it. But he was there to go to the parole, probation office to get his GPS monitor removed. And I was there with my camera so I could get him, leaving the courthouse. And uh, I heard two of the court officers talking, and one of them was like, "Why is that? Why is the media here? Why does somebody have a camera?" And the other guy was telling him, it's this guy. He's been in prison for like 40 years. He's finally gotten out. His case was overturned. And the other guy was like, like, damn, he's gonna be rich. And I kind of want to go over them and be like, you guys got to read my other reporting. So there are two. It's not that easy, unfortunately, but if there's sort of two ways to get compensation if you're wrongfully convicted in Massachusetts. One is through a federal lawsuit, which is true regardless of what state you're in. And this is a really difficult process. Like, you have to
Yeah.
file a lawsuit and you have to prove deliberate misconduct by someone who works for the government. So it can't be necessarily like it's got to be someone who works for the government. And if it's the prosecutor, prosecutors have like what's called absolute immunity, which, as it sounds, generally, if the prosecutor, even if they did misconduct, it can't get you, a civil rights payout. If it's like the police or any other government employee, they might have qualified immunity, which I think is something people are more familiar with these days. But it's basically like, if something isn't, clearly established to violate your constitutional rights, then they can give the, police officer or government employee qualified immunity, which basically means that even if it did violate your rights, there's no like previous court case establishing that exact conduct would violate your rights, and therefore the government employee is off the hook and you can't sue them. And so you have to prove misconduct, and you have to get over. It has to be someone who is not, immune based on these kind of like vague rules. And another problem is that even if the person's not immune, they can raise the immunity as a defense, which adds to the cost of the litigation because your lawyers have to fight out whether or not they are immune. So that's, extra court hearings, extra filings, extra billable hours for all the attorneys and everything. And so this is a really challenging, it's and some people who are wrongfully convicted, their civil rights were not necessarily violated. As crazy as that sounds, like
It makes
no,
sense.
they may have been, found guilty of something they didn't do, but nobody like deliberately violated their civil rights.
Right.
And so they're not even eligible to, do one of these lawsuits. And so, but we have another law that is specific to Massachusetts where you also have to file a lawsuit. And technically the standard of proof is like higher. It is, but you don't have to prove deliberate misconduct. So it's like for some people, this is the only way you're going to get compensated. But it's still really challenging because again, you have to file a lawsuit, and a lawsuit is something that takes like literally it's not like weeks, it's not months, it's years of litigation.
And nobody can, but in case nobody will be surprised who's watching this, who watches this, to learn that prosecutors in Massachusetts, they've never been wrong about anything. There's never a concession. And I think, without going on and on, I think that's a great lead up. The James Carver case, which I know you began to speak about, but I think I just want to, we really needed that backdrop because it's just so massive, and it's really the most sickening part of it to me. Well, one of them is what's the lack of concession at this juncture, despite a judge's base. Is it fair to call it an intervention, or I don't know, a judge stepping in? And so why don't you just tell us about Carver? And this, of course, is a famous arson case. People from that North Shore, or not? Maybe that's that. Is that the North Shore, Revere, Beverly?
Yeah.
Yep.
I know physically it is. I just don't know if
It's funny.
people actually
There's
walk
been a
the
big
case.
debate
Yes,
on North
okay.
Shore boards lately because I grew up in Peabody primarily, and other than Dorchester.
So this
And
is a story that people up there know. And
yeah,
Jason, you had heard of it, from growing up
I
there.
had, yeah, because I was going to high school in Danvers, right around the time that was happening. Yeah.
So yeah, Andrew, how did you get linked up with the Carver case, and what was it that said? Because I got to give you, this is the kind of work that people have to understand. There's no way we could ever, Andrew, this was a big one. We co-published this. I got to give props, of course, to the appeal. Just tireless work by all these parties involved. And maybe you didn't know you were going to quite get into it that deep. But what made you say this is the one that you really went hard? You ended up establishing contact with the family, doing countless interviews. So what made you say this is the one you're going to invest that time in?
I remember, I think it was back when I was in college, there was a big piece in the New Yorker called Trial by Fire that was about the Todd Willingham case out in Texas. This guy who got, he was accused, I hope I don't butcher any of the details, but I believe what happened was he was convicted of killing members of his own family through arson. And he was actually executed, but there was like a commission established after, and basically it was all junk science that he was convicted on. It was like I think there like it's there's all this stuff about arson that used to be accepted um, by the people who did the investigations, who were generally they're like firefighters or cops who do not have any scientific or engineering background, and the profession sort of it sort of became a profession eventually, like it professionalized, like as there was more science done about how to investigate fires. I mean, I still don't know if it's totally perfect system, but what they have done is they've ruled out a lot of these like urban legends that were relied on. Like I want to say in the Willingham case, one of them was like the idea of like a pour pattern where like you can look at the ground and you can say, oh, they're based on the way the damage is on the floor, there had to have been a puddle of gasoline there. It's a pour pattern, meaning they poured a liquid there that they used to start the fire. And I remember reading in the Salem News, because I just follow a lot of local news. I saw something about guys challenging his conviction based on some old fire back in like, was it like 2022 or something? And I just opened it. I read it. It was like not a very long piece or anything, but it had just a few details about it. And I was like, wow, I was like, holy shit. I was like, this sounds like that thing I read about years ago, um, where it was based on a lot of like outdated, so-called forensic science. And I called his lawyer and I was like, hey, like, I'm curious about this. And she sent me over some of the documents. I started reading them, and I just like, the more I read, like, the more I was just like, holy
And
shit, this case
the
is
big one,
crazy.
Andrew, the big one being that fire doesn't travel down, right? It doesn't travel downwards. So that was one of the big myths. If I,
Yeah, that was a big myth. And it is I mean, I've had multiple people be like, "Well, what about like matches? Like how some of the fire, like it'll burn out eventually, but it'll spread down like a little bit at least before it burns out." Um, but like so in the Carver case, he's accused of setting this rooming house fire that killed 15 people in Beverly in 1984, and there were a few myths that were used to. I mean, so I guess first of all, when you're talking about it as something like arson, it's like there's two pieces. It's like first you establish that the fire was deliberately set, and then once you've established that, it's just a matter of like narrowing down who is the most likely culprit to have
Mm.
done that. And um, but if you get the first part
Yeah,
wrong,
if you
then
screw up
you're
that first part,
yeah. If you get the first part wrong, then you're looking
you're on a
you're
witch
you're
hunt,
like yeah, you're on a
very
witch
close
hunt.
to
Like
Salem.
exactly, you're on a witch hunt, and you're basically trying to say, somebody had to have do it. We gotta look for a potential motive,
Oh,
and then you spin out a whole narrative based on that. But they came to the conclusion within like a few days. I'm sorry, within a day, that this was arson. And then they brought in a guy from like New York who had more experience investigating these cases than the state trooper they had assigned, and he came to the same conclusion. And what he said was, so he determined that the fire started in this alcove outside the building. It's an entrance to the rooming house, so like outside the doorway, and it started on a bundle of newspapers that was kind of like wedged in the corner. And he said it had to have been someone like dousing the newspapers with gasoline and setting them on fire. And he said that there was this alligator charring pattern on the walls of the alcove. And the idea that a lot of people used to have was that if a fire spread like really quickly, it had to have been like started with gasoline, because it would, the theory was it would like get hot faster. And so you could like look at the depth of the like char, and like versus how big the spread of this alligator charring was, and you could determine whether or not it was set with a flammable liquid. And it's total like junk. It doesn't it doesn't it doesn't correspond with whether the fire was started with gasoline or not. It's just complete speculation. And they actually had lab tests done that did not find any flammable liquid. But the thing is, like, it's like any good conspiracy theory, is there's an explanation for why there's no evidence for it. And it's that, oh well, the water the firefighters used washed it away, so there's no way to disprove it. But it doesn't actually, it's not based on anything in the first place. um, and
it's not.
then the other thing you mentioned was the idea that like fire can't burn downward, and that is how he established that it started at the newspapers, because the newspapers are on ground level. That's the
Mm.
lowest place you find any burning. And so the fire, according to him, had to have started on the newspapers and then traveled upward. But the problem with that is that if that's not true, and it's not, then the fire could have started higher and then spread downward. And so James Carver's lawyers, after this guy had been in prison for decades, had tried through different other he's tried other ways of getting out of prison, like looking for alternative suspects and some other stuff like that. But the sort of winning strategy that his lawyers found which was not necessarily even possible because again, it takes time for like science to develop. It's one of the problems with when they rely on it's crazy. Like you can rely on this outdated forensic science, so-called science, as long as some judge allows it in, a judge who doesn't have scientific training. But then the real scientists have to do all the science before they can prove that you're innocent. It's kind of backwards. But he had a engineer who's actually he was on the committee for the manual that the National Fire Protection Association puts out for investigating fires. So he's a very credentialed, very respected in his field engineer, Craig Byler, who I believe is also on the commission related to that Todd Willingham case I talked about, more than a decade ago in
Mhm.
Texas. Um, and he looked at this case based on all the reports and the photographs and all this other evidence that has survived all the testimony. And he said that the fire, in his opinion, started in the like overhang that's above this alcove. So there's like a little ceiling above it, like when you enter into an alcove in a building, there's going to be like a ceiling, and he said that there was one of the things that came up in his testimony, because there was a court hearing about this, was that he's pointing out that when you enter a building, there's usually like a light above the doorway
Mhm.
because people need to be able to get their keys out and open the door. And so there was likely some kind of light there. And in fact, there were wires hanging out in photographs that are connected to nothing, just free hanging wires in some of the photographs. And these were like ruled out by the investigator at the time based on what he said were unscientific ideas about how electrical fires start. And he was saying there's likely some kind of electrical fire that started in the overhang of this building. Or I'm sorry, he didn't say it was necessarily that it was an electrical fire. What he said, using the scientific method is you look at what is possible and what can be ruled out. And if you can't rule that something out, then it is a possibility. And so he said he couldn't rule out accidental causes, including electrical fires. And because he can't rule that possibility out, you can't say it was arson. But he also went further and he was saying that the prosecutor's theory of how this fire started was not even physically possible because
Okay.
the newspapers, if set on fire, would not have created a powerful enough flame to spread to the walls of the building. Like if you think about if you held up like a big block of wood and you held a match to it, you might it might get you might make a black spot on it, but it's not actually going to like catch on fire and like be fully
Right,
engulfed
right, right.
in flame. Like it's the same principle. Like you could set a bunch of newspapers on fire, you get like a really small fire, it'll burn out in a few seconds. It's not going to set a building on fire and kill 15 people. um, and yeah, and the judge ultimately overturned Carver's conviction based solely on the issue of whether or not like there was proof of a flammable liquid used to start the fire. And this was something that the DA's office actually had to concede. They had their own expert witness who was like a retired state police fire investigator who I believe now works in like private industry. um, and he looked at this and he said, yeah, he's right. These are all myths about whether or not a flammable liquid was used. There's no like hard evidence that one was used, but he claimed that the original theory was still possible in terms of the fire starting on the newspapers. He did
Of
not reach that
course.
conclusion about
Which
what.
which is like, so I mean, everybody really hears this except for the prosecutor. So just round us off. I mean, so what is ultimately, how does James get sprung? And it's temporary, from what I still understand. Well, in a sense, right? And and what's the last of what the prosecutors are looking at? Generations later of prosecutors in the same office. It's like people who like a football team, no matter who's playing for it, decades later. I guess this it's just, to me, this is one of the things I always think. It's not like prosecutors are looking so great in Massachusetts these days. Imagine generating some goodwill, being like, you know what? Yeah, we fucked up. 30 years ago. I mean, who doesn't love throwing another person under the bus, from a predecessor. I don't know. Anyway, where are we now in this case, and where is James Carver?
Well, so the thing about overturning a wrongful conviction is the way it's done is through what's called a motion for a new trial, which is basically you have to either show that there's new evidence that was not available at the time of your original trial, either because it's like in the case of scientific evidence, the science may not have existed, or it may have been like a witnesses that you had no way of knowing, would have had
Mhm.
information about the case, or something along those lines. Or it could be evidence that was withheld from you by the prosecution, like in the case of Edward Wright. Um, or, you know, if say there was evidence that should have theoretically been available to you, there's still potentially a way out, which is that if it's called uh, like ineffective assistance of counsel. It's basically when your lawyer's performance was like so
Right.
poor that you were denied the right to a fair trial based
The
on
drunken lawyer out.
evidence.
Right.
Um, and um, basically, once you get, you have to get into court. You got to convince the judge to overturn your case. But then the prosecution, they first of all, they have the option to retry you, which it's somewhat rare from what I've been able to gather, because typically these cases will get overturned like decades later. And the thing about that is, witnesses have died.
Right.
People's memories are bad, so you put them on the witness stand, they're going to get torn to shreds.
Yeah.
They may not even, they literally might not even remember like any of the stuff they testified to. Like I've talked to people in the Carver case, and I asked them about stuff they testified about, and they like literally didn't even
Yeah. I
remember
mean, who
stuff.
could?
And so there's that element to it, although it doesn't necessarily prevent them from retrying the case. It does happen. But before they even get to that point, they have the option to appeal the judge's ruling. And basically, they're arguing essentially as a matter of law that the judge was incorrect to overturn the person's conviction. So they're not like relitigating the facts necessarily. They're not trying to establish any new facts or anything. They're just trying to say the judge who overturned this case shouldn't have overturned it, like based on the law. And that's where James Carver's case is right now. It's before the
Gotcha.
Massachusetts Appeals Court, and the court's currently awaiting for all of the arguments, the briefs to come in. And I said this before the Massachusetts Appeals Court. It is possible that Carver, I have no idea whether this will happen or not yet, but that they may ask the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court to take the case directly and sort of skip over the appeals court, which would speed things up. And of course, if the SJC doesn't take it right away, the appeals court might rule on it, and then it might get appealed and go to the SJC anyway. So, and it's one of the things about these cases is that they can drag on even after like the person's conviction is overturned. And
Mm-hmm.
the community has like a name for this. It's called like free but still fighting. Like you're out of prison but you're still fighting for your freedom at the same time.
So many
Um,
wrongfully convicted people. There's a community.
mm,
And so wow. So I mean, this is definitely you're bringing more stories to us in this realm, and we hope to do just continue this work. I think it's we're known for our niches, but I'm glad to even have micro niches. This is something that overlaps a lot, right? Prison, parole, just a lot of these issues, and but man, it's really harrowing to think of how many people are locked up in general, and then wrongfully convicted, and then on top of it, I mean, this is a burden, and that's what a lot of your reporting. We haven't dwelled on it too much, really talking about the specifics, but that the haze on top of the burden, on top of the nightmare, on top of the and it's at the hands of a lot of these district attorneys and the ADAs who are just relentless. And we could go on, and I just think, and I hate to even mention Karen Reed in the in the context of, dozens and dozens of people who were not fortunate enough, not that she's lucky to have gone through what she went through, but to have had that kind of um, defense team. But that's really something I was editing you a lot while that was going on, and I kept looking at that $1 million table of attorneys and thinking, like, this is basically what it takes. And maybe also whether, I guess whether the army outside helped or hurt is up for debate, but it really takes a lot more than just being innocent. And that's whether that's beforehand, that's after, that's during, while you're incarcerated, and that apparently is even after a judge decides that this is nonsense. So, any
Uh,
go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
have you noticed anything in common between the cases that you've been looking at? Because that's something I haven't seen enough reporting on, and I don't know if you have an interest in it or not. But between the people who get screwed over by the supposed justice system like this, and I mean, imagine the nightmare of going to going to jail for decades. An incredible
It's
injustice.
not even believable. It's like
It's like the worst horror movie, you know?
Yeah.
it
Well,
really is.
I mean, there's not every case is different, but there's like definitely certain commonalities that are, appear in a lot of different cases. Like there's people who are, coerced into providing false confessions.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There are, there's police just straight up lying or planting evidence or
Sure.
hiding evidence. There is uh bad eyewitness testimony. This is less common now, but of course, the cases that are getting overturned are decades old. So many of them relied on this. It's something that's more
Mm.
known about now. Um, but that was actually something that came up in James Carver's case as well, and was another reason his case was overturned, was faulty eyewitness testimony. There is bad forensics. um, like I was mentioning too before, like it sometimes these things will get in there, they'll become part of the fabric of the criminal justice system, and then decades later research shows, oops, that was maybe not such a great idea. And you saw that, like, to bring it back to the Karen Reed case, Chris, you saw like accident reconstruction and all this stuff during Karen Reed, dog bite experts, blah blah blah. Like there's all
Mhm.
kind, like if you can get a judge to declare someone an expert, then they can provide all kinds of crazy testimony about anything. um as long as you kind of wrap it in a this like veil of professionalism, then anybody can be an expert about anything, and you can,
Well, remember the
Yeah.
child abuse experts of the 90s, right?
yeah,
And all the
exactly.
horrendous damage they did, to
Yeah,
people that
the
were just nursery school workers who didn't touch anybody,
yeah.
you know.
And stuff like that happened in Massachusetts too.
Yeah, it sure did. It's, yeah.
But
But
Um,
yeah.
I would say that the thing I have noticed a lot, though, which I don't think is all, it's not even, it's something that doesn't get reflected enough in the reporting, and it's sort of hard to, because of the level of like research you need to do, and you have to write longer pieces and whatnot. But what I notice is that it's not just one or two things. It's like everything goes wrong. Like your attorney is incompetent, or they're compromised in some way. The prosecution is out to get you. There's bad evidence.
mhm.
It's everything in a blender. Like in the James Carver
Bad
case,
judge.
his attorney had like a drug and alcohol problem, and was
Yeah.
also like he was he made like lewd phone calls to young girls and women, and he even in people who were connected to the case. um there was, I mentioned, there was bad eyewitness testimony in his case. There's
Well,
in
I'm also asking that.
James Carver's case, there was prosecutorial misconduct. His first case ended in a mistrial because the prosecution withheld police reports from the defense. So it's everything. And like I
I mean, I'm
mentioned in
asking a sociological question as well
Sure.
about the people that get trapped in this. Are they mostly poor? Are they mostly black? Are they mostly guys? Like that kind of stuff. Have you noticed that kind of commonality, as well as the mechanics
Well,
of these situations?
I would say it's a lot of the same things you see, with the legal system at large,
Right.
where the more strikes you have against you, the more likely you are to be wrongfully convicted. If you're black, if you're poor, and I think another thing is that we use this word innocent to talk about people, and the truth is that people can be wrongfully convicted and they're innocent of the crime that they're convicted
Mm.
of. That doesn't mean they're um, that they haven't committed other crimes.
Yeah.
And in fact, that can make you more likely to get wrongfully convicted because first of all, if the police think, oh, this guy's a criminal, uh, they might they might assume that, oh, this is the kind of person who's gonna, this guy, we've caught him with a gun before, he's done armed robbery. Of course, he's the kind of person who would murder someone. Uh, and if you have cops who are willing to lie or plant evidence or whatever, they might say, well, I don't care whether he did it. I know this guy's bad news because he has done other stuff and I want to get him off the street. So it doesn't matter whether he actually did this specific crime or not. I'm just going to pin it on him and get him out of here before he does
Yeah.
go on and murder somebody. There's that element to it. So, but obviously, that's not how the legal system should work. We should, every case should be innocent until proven guilty, and people should be convicted for the things they've done, not the things that the police think they might do or that they don't care whether they did it or not. Like they should be. Uh, but that I think that that's certainly part of it. But James Carver is a white guy who came
Mhm.
from. Where did I want to say his dad worked for like Raytheon.
Mhm.
They lived they owned their own home. He was like he owned like a luxury sports car. That was like his hobby.
Wow.
I'm talking about James Carver himself as like a young 20 something. He had like
Mhm.
so it doesn't mean you're a poor black guy living in the city. It can happen to anyone, although it does, generally happen to, particular, marginalized groups of people more often.
Yeah, well,
Oh,
if they want you, they want you, and so we appreciate your time. And tell us, like, what are some just what why people see from you. And I don't know, there's still legislation. It's Massachusetts, so these things go on forever. Is there, what should people who are interested in this look for? Your reporting, mass dump. I know there's a couple of cases you're following, and updates in general on legislation and or particular cases.
Yeah, I did a story back in July called Ain't Nobody Helping Me, More Calls for Reforms to Massachusetts Wrongful Conviction Compensation Law. That talks about um, the sort of how hard it is to get compensated currently and the proposed changes in this bill, which still has not passed, so it's still relevant. Um, I'm gonna be writing soon about bills aimed at preventing like false confessions. There's some legislation about that, uh, and if people are interested in this, they can follow my reporting. Obviously, I appreciate that. If you go to the mass dump, but you can also follow some of the there's sort of three major innocence groups in Massachusetts. There's the Boston College Innocence Program. There's CPCS, which is the Public Defender's Office, has an innocence program. And then there's also the New England Innocence Project. And the New England Innocence Project is probably the best source of information in terms of like what are the upcoming events. Um, they do several events every year that are kind of aimed at raising awareness about the causes of wrongful convictions and about specific cases. And they actually have one tomorrow because tomorrow is wrongful conviction day, which is uh, I guess it's an international thing. It's in different cities or different states, different innocence
Wow.
groups do events to kind of raise awareness about wrongful convictions. And at 12:30 outside the State House tomorrow, they're going to be having a press conference with Edward Wright, so you can actually see him speak tomorrow if you go to Boston around lunchtime. I expect to be there, and then afterward they're going to march from the State House to City Hall, and just have kind of a rally. And if you ever go to these events, I go to like pretty much I go to most of them, and you will start to recognize a lot of faces. And a lot of the people who go to these things are formerly incarcerated, wrongfully convicted people. There are, and as you start to recognize more and more faces, you just realize how many people there are who have been wrongfully convicted. And these are the ones, of course, that we know about because, their cases have been overturned. And they don't necessarily, they of course don't represent the full number of people, because there are obviously going to still be people in prison, who are fighting or who may have even been forgotten about, unfortunately. But
I think this is like, and again, unfortunately, not to keep trumpeting, but the same. This is like everybody should be in agreement, and I don't say that about many issues. On this one, it's like clean air, right? And I'm not gonna set up straw man and say that people aren't, but I just feel that with all these armchair sleuths out there, and I mean, this is just, it's hard to say it's a pressing issue because these are all separate issues, but not the part about compensation, not some of the systemic issues that. So, thanks for your reporting. We're gonna I'll keep check in with you next week, and we'll get another piece going. This is definitely something that I'm glad people could look to BINJ for. Certainly, they should look to Mass Dump for the regular follow-ups, but really, absolutely heart-wrenching stuff. Your reporting is just really excellent, Andrew. Detailed.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew.
Even when you told
Good job.
the vignette before you started with a little narrative lead, I appreciate about So everybody definitely check that out. If you're by the State House and you happen to see this, we're gonna cut some YouTube shorts. So get out little parts of this too. But yeah, this is definitely something we're excited to be continuing to do work on. So thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah,
thanks, Andrew Quemere. Thanks for coming on. Thank you, Chris, as ever. And so this has been BINJ Live number 3. We'll be back next Tuesday at 8 p.m. with our special guest and co-worker, Linda Pinkow, talking about a new news show at WMBR FM. And that'll be a fun conversation. And now I'm just going to have everyone freeze for a moment, because every time we end the show, it keeps clipping off really fast. So I want to see if we could prevent that. Yeah, Chris is already frozen. So thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
It's like 20 seconds.
Here we go.